Okay, so we're in Python control flows and we're now looking at the if statement, which is the second of our control flows. So I'm just going to scroll down to the if statement. And one thing that I'm going to do is just drag over the control flows of in the Python documentation itself. So we looked at the while statement, but there's more control flows that are available to us and they have some extra twists compared to other languages. And I'm actually going to copy, you can click on these triple arrows here for the purpose of copying some of the code. But I'm not going to copy, I'm going to actually use it and go through it line by line. But we've got like an input thing that's not part of the if statement, but we'll add that in because it's in the documentation itself. And then we're going to look at this if statement, which comes along with some elifs, which are else ifs, and then an else statement at the end. And we also see that this sequence here is a substitute, so we can use a bunch of else ifs as a substitute for the switch or case statements that are found in other languages. And recently Python has introduced match statements, which we'll cover in a different section, but they give the same type of feel. So let's just dig into looking at the if statements now. The first thing that we're going to do, and I will copy this piece of code here, is we're going to have this input statement, but I'm actually going to remove the int part of it. And the reason why is I'm just going to this input statement, if we hover over it, we see what it actually says. It reads a string from a standard input. The trailing new line is stripped. But basically what it does is it allows a user to input a value. This stops the control flow until the user has input a value, hit return, and then that value gets assigned to this variable x. We see here that whatever is returned is in fact a string, and that's why this input was enclosed inside of the integer typecasting. But we'll just do this and we'll do print x like this, and we'll just see how it runs. So I'm going to hit control return to run the code, and at the top, so if I do that, at the top over here we see please enter an integer, and we can enter a value into this box. So I'll put in the number, for example 100, and hit return, and we see that 100 comes back. But if we do this, which is print the type of x, and then we run that little piece of code again and we put in the same 100, we actually see that it comes back as a class string, and that's why this input in the Python documentation that we had before was surrounded with an int statement, because we need to typecast it. I'm going to just explicitly do that, so I'll just do x equals int, just so that we can see exactly what's happening for the purpose of this. X equals int of x. So we're taking our value of x. That was a string. Anything that comes back from this input method is a string, and it goes and we're turning that into an integer. So now when we run this same piece of code and we type in 100 and hit return, we see that it's now a class of integer. So that's what that above bit was about. I'll remove the type bit and I'll remove the print part of it too. And now we'll move on to the if statement. And again, I'm just going to be copying a large part of this code. But what we'll do is, well, I'll go through it. So we say if x is less than 0, and then it's like a then sign. When I hit return, we get this indentation, and we'll see a bit more about this indentation in a second. But we say if x is less than 0, so if x is a negative number, then set x equal to 0, and then print negative value changed to 0. Now, just before we move any further, we can have the if statement as we are on its own without putting any else ifs and without putting any else's. So we could do this. And one thing to note is that this indentation part is part of the block of code. Just like when we were in the while statement, it was the same. So anything that's indented is part of this if statement here. So these two lines are run as part of the if statement. So we'll just run this piece of code now, control return, And if x is less than 0, so a negative number, we're going to change the number to 0. So let's just do that, minus 100, and hit return, and the negative value is changed to 0. So that's basically it. We know that our if statement works, and we can do the alternative case. So again, we'll just run this piece of code and make it a positive number. So we'll say number 10, and nothing happens. So again, just to make sure that our code has run or something, we might want to put, well, we could just put a print here and then finished, like this. But the alternative is to actually use an else statement. So we'll do that instead, because we used a, we did a print finished previously. So let's just put in an else statement here, not an else if at this point in time, just an else statement. So if x is less than 0, we've changed our negative, we've changed our value to 0. Otherwise, if x is not less than 0, so it's not negative, print did not do anything. And then we can even give back our value of x. So something like that, we'll just return back x. And we won't, I'm just wondering if I should leave the print finished. You know what, why not? We'll leave a print finished in here just for the sake of it, just so that we can see all of the lines of the control flow. So we'll hit return and run, and this time we will have a negative 10, for example, and run our code, and we see down the bottom that the negative value is changed to 0, and this finished statement is run on line 13, but this else statement did not get triggered, and the reason why is because this if statement was satisfied, and therefore the block of code inside the if statement was run. So that's generally how it works basically. And we'll just move on and do our next version of it, which is the number greater than 0, so like 100, and hit return, and we got did not do anything. So this time this if condition was not satisfied, so this block of code, lines number 7 and 8, did not get run, and instead we jumped to the else statement, and it printed out this block of code here that was indented inside of it, did not do anything, and printed out a value of 100. But we can actually go even further. Python offers us a bit more. We can use an elif statement like this, and it gets the same sort of indentation, and we can do a check. So let's do else if, and we're going to check for another criteria. Let's check if x is logically equal to 0. Notice I said logically equal to, because this is not an assignment operator. So whereas here we're actually assigning a value, this we're checking that the values are equal. So if x equals to 0, let's print. And also notice, until I've actually put something in here, we have a squiggly underscore, because it's expecting something to be in the block of code, as in it's empty. And if we did want to have a blank piece of code, we might use a placeholder. So let's just print and then 0, just like this. So if x equals 0, we've got a 0. So we will run this piece of code, and we're going to do our checks, and we'll just check for the 0 case just to see that it runs, and we'll hit in at 0, and we get 0 finished. And notice that this block of code did not run, and this block of code did not run. So we've run through our statements. The else if was satisfied, that was good enough, and then we jumped out of our block and we printed finished on from line number 15. So that's how it works. But we can do even more than that. We're not restricted to one else if, we can do multiple else ifs. So we can do else if x equals 1, we can check for something else, and do print single, like this. And when we run this piece of code now, we can also check for a value of 1 and just see that it works. If we hit 1 and run it, we get single. So now we've got all of the criteria that we wanted to put in. We've got an if statement that could work on its own. We've got an if statement that could work with an else statement, and we could put in a bunch of else ifs, which are elifs in Python. So that's generally how the if statement works for the purpose of control flow in Python.